Hey, tonight the boys and I answer listener comments. Perhaps identify the first mother of the Nephilim? And Brian tells you why resurrection solves the problem with evil. That's what we have coming up. So keep it right here on Mount Hermeneutics. You're listening to Mount Hermeneutics, where three Marines give their perspective on God, faith, and spirituality with a heavy lean on the divine council worldview. This is not your grandma's Sunday school, nor is it always for the Christian faint of heart. Nothing about who we are or what we say make us experts. But you better believe we'll have a take, and perhaps it won't suck.
People who curl in the squat rack are you are the reason people don't believe in God. So to the people who complained about us bantering too long,
yeah, which is a bunch of those people.
You're banned from the show.
Yeah, I was gonna say, hey, I don't know if you know or not, but our last episode has 41 views. So why don't you just go ahead and leave the content to the professionals? You know, we're the famous ones. Do you have 41 views?
We have dozens of listeners.
Dozens,
we don't need you.
Dozens of listeners.
You don't like our banter, you get your own podcast.
Yeah, you're banned from the show.
Shut your filthy holes. I'm just kidding. We're sorry. Please come back. We'll quit. We repent. Down to business.
Oh man. So I guess our pilot episode got lost in the ether.
Yeah, we recorded it and I set it somewhere and I haven't been able to find it. So we have this maybe someday it'll be famous. It'll be the lost episode.
Be like the holy grail of Mount Hermeneutics.
I don't know where it went when we recorded it, right? So it's funny because as everybody's been giving us feedback, and by the way, thanks everybody for the feedback. Everybody that's communicating directly with me, the first that gets into episode 1 and 2, the first thing they say is you guys' audio sucks. And I'm like, I know, it gets better. You got to bear with us. And then I remember one of the comments was do I need to take up a fundraiser to get Andre a new microphone? And I was like, well, in fairness, he was in his car on Bluetooth, and they're like, oh, that'll do it. So anybody that's made it through the first 4 episodes, and maybe it's 5, appreciate you guys hanging with us. But yeah, the technology has been a challenge in of itself, and we've just been doing all this linearly, right? So we're addressing one thing at a time. That's why our first 7, 8, 9 episodes on YouTube don't have video. I think I have the video somewhere recorded, but we weren't editing in real time. So it would be like a recut, which would be like a remaster, if you will. And I don't know that we have the bandwidth for that. So now we're trying to make a better go at, keeping the audio and the video integrated so that they can both be, watched and viewed or listened to at the same time. But let us know in the comments also what format you guys prefer. Is regular traditional podcasting audio only what you guys are interested in, or who's consuming via YouTube? So let us know that, because we don't know where to spend our time and energy. And for those that don't know, we don't have an army of interns working for us. It's literally just the 3 of us, mostly me doing the editing, and then Dre's helping me out with the social media posts. But let us know which ones are easier to consume, better to consume, and keep the comments going. And anybody listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe below. The subscription helps our analytics, helps the algorithm get us up in the top so people find us. But drop comments, get some conversation going. We have it turned on, it's free form, so any comments will go. Tell us what you like, what you don't like, ask a question, talk amongst yourselves. Let's make it hot.
Yeah. And I do have a new microphone. What I don't have is a lot of privacy though. So I've got a house full of people from time to time, and so you'll probably hear my dogs bark or my granddaughter yell at something, or like last week my granddaughter and wife had a little cameo just popped over my shoulder because something was going on. So but yeah, now I'm in my dining room right here in my house with all the goings on over there. So yeah, hey, still better than the Mazda though. So in the parking lot of
Much
like
better.
a base PX. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where I was.
Outside the shopette.
That's right. People coming out with all kinds of booze. I'm like,
So speaking of comments, so Jason, hey, thanks for the questions. You mentioned that you're only on episode 1 and you lost the pilot. So the funny thing is, in the pilot we actually talked about our faith background. So it's kind of funny that we haven't gone back and revisited that, and we should probably mention that from time to time quickly, just so people actually kind of have a point of reference as to where we're coming from. So I think maybe we go around the horn real quick and kind of tell everybody, where our faith kind of comes from, or I guess that's a weird way to state it, but the basis of our faith and kind of who we are. And since I'm talking, I'll start. I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, very traditional Southern Baptist, for those that know. If you know, you know. Lots of Wednesday nights and Sunday evenings, and a couple of times a year we do a revival, which was nothing but hellfire, brimstone, lots of singing, no dancing, because we're Southern Baptist. And I probably went to church as early as I can remember. I mean, and I'm old enough that I have pictures of me wearing a suit as like a 4-year-old to church. Like, that's how Southern Baptist I grew up. Went to church all through high school, did the youth thing, joined the Marine Corps, and they're not the most compatible with your deep religion and faith following, neither being in your early 20s. So I would say I am today not a Southern Baptist, not for a specific reason other than I don't follow any, there's parts of it I like and parts of it I don't. And I'm not going to get into all of that here because that's a show in of itself. But Brian, you haven't talked. Do you want to talk about your faith background?
Yeah, I wasn't raised in the church. We'd go to church on occasion on Christmas Eve and stuff. I was 17 years old before I realized that Easter was supposed to be in celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. That's how little we talked about religion in my upbringing. I was huge into martial arts as a teenager, and so I basically I was a Zen Buddhist for all intents and purposes. But when I joined the Marine Corps, when they asked what should go on my dog tags, we put Protestant Christian for whatever reason. But I wasn't a Christian until I was 20 years old in the Marine Corps. Became a born again Christian. I met someone who was able to answer my questions. Before, when I was in high school, people would invite me to church, and I would just ask them questions like, not to challenge them or be rude or attack them, but just out of genuine curiosity. Well, why do you guys believe this stuff? Why do you believe the Bible is the word of God and Jesus is the Son of God and rose from the dead and all that stuff? And they never really answered. They just kind of seemed offended that I was asking, and it was more like what, you don't believe that? It just the sense I got was that they believed this was just virtuous to believe for its own sake without any basis in reason or evidence. And so I just never really had much interest in it till somebody answered my questions and gave me Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter. And there were a bunch of other events that led to me realizing that God is real and Jesus Christ is his representative of himself, is God incarnate. And I became a Christian on Easter Sunday of 1996, and been at it ever since.
So last but not least, Dre, yours is probably the most complicated. So I thought we'd go last with you.
So my father is from Alabama and my mother's from San Fernando Valley in Southern California. He's a Southern Baptist and she was a Lutheran. So as I was growing up, there was always lots of, God talk in my house, but nothing really. We didn't go to church. When I did go to church, I went with my great grandmother, and I think she was just a born again Christian. And we went to, that's where I learned how to do all the songs and had fun. But then one day when I was about 7 years old, my mother had some Bible study with some Jehovah's Witnesses. and also there was a Jehovah's Witnesses that were in my father's work, and then they converted. So by the time I was 7 years old, that was my last Halloween, as it were, and I dressed up as Yoda, because Return of the Jedi was coming out right around that time, and definitely Empire Strikes Back. So I was Yoda for my very last Halloween when I was 7 years old. Um, so just growing up in the Jehovah's Witness way, I was on the street in a suit from the time I was 8 until I was close to.
Yeah, Drake got a little background noise there. Somebody must have riled up the canines.
Yeah.
While he's settling that down, I just make a comment that's got to be really memorable because of the nuance there. That whole last Halloween thing. That's kind of a funny thing. Kids like, man, I used to like Halloween. All that free candy.
I'm kind of bummed over
What's
that.
wild about that is that I didn't get my last Christmas at that time, right?
Because it happened right in between.
Yeah,
like in November.
Halloween to we don't celebrate Christmas.
Right.
Like, I'm 7.
You're like, hold on, what did I do wrong?
Right? So
I've been good all year.
My brother's only 2, so he doesn't
remember that.
Yeah. But yeah, I was doing, so it's 3 nights a week. There's the Tuesday night Bible study, of course. There's the Sunday Watchtower meeting and in the sermon, and then Thursday night is theocratic ministry school. So for a long time, even when I was about in junior high, I did a lot of theocratic ministry school stuff where they teach you about how to talk to people, basically the sales pitch, right? And then you actually get graded on it. So basically you would get like a Bible passage, you'd have to read it and whatever, like for that week. One of those times I remember, I think I was 12, hand gestures was the thing I was being graded on. So
wow. So you're like getting like public speaking skills as a child. Yeah, I mean that's useful. It
was, and it is. But anyway, by the time I got to high school, my dad really wasn't involved in it. My mother was the only one in our house baptized. I kind of fell out of that thing, and then I joined the United States Marine Corps. And as you know, Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah, so Jehovah's Witnesses are conscientious objectors, and they don't pledge allegiance to the flag. They don't pledge allegiance because they don't put the flag above God. So I had to just convince my recruiter that I was denouncing that, and then I went. So, but before I went to boot camp, I met a young lady. She's from Utah, and she and her family are all LDS. So as I go to boot camp, I'm like, hey, I got this girl that I'm into, so I'm gonna start just checking out the LDS faith while I'm there.
And Dre, to be clear, LDS for those that don't know what it stands for,
the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons. So you probably heard the Mormon word, but they are Latter-day Saints.
They kind of consider that to be like the M word, right? With
them,
they don't like that as it's a pejorative more so than a descriptor.
I think so lately, yeah.
Even
though they do read out of the Book of Mormon,
right?
So that's where that
haven't they been kind of leaning into that though, the Mormon label?
No, quite the opposite.
Yeah, quite the opposite. But yeah, so I got privileges in boot camp because their service was super long, and there was no drill instructors there, so that was fun. But I ended up getting married to the lady. I have never converted. If I do go to church on Sundays, it is an LDS chapel that I do go to, and go through their Sundays. All of my children were baptized in the LDS. My oldest daughter is the most practicing. She got married to another LDS member. They got married and sealed in the temple. And yeah, my son, he's working on it. He's got an LDS girlfriend, and he's like in Utah right now. And yeah, so of the two faiths that I'm the most familiar with, they're both non-Trinitarians. So if you listen to a few episodes back, you can kind of hear where I'm coming from, and Brian explained, why the Trinity is Christianity, and I don't have to rehash those 3 episodes, but it was a good time. So I'm learning.
Yeah, we'll put a link up here. If I can figure out how to do links, we'll link back to that episode because I think that's probably highly germane to what we just talked about. But But yeah, thanks guys. And Jason, thanks for asking that, because we did lose that initial, we did a whole, hour of us telling who we are and how we met and all of those kinds of things. We met in the Marine Corps. I'll hyper simplify that. So we've known each other for going on 25, 26
30.
years, almost 30 years. Oh, good Lord.
Would have been 94. So
Yeah, it was definitely
it
late
was
94.
29 years at this point.
Yep. Yeah. So going on 30 years.
You guys are old.
That we've known each other. And you can imagine there's a lot that goes into having known each other for that long. So that's kind of our backgrounds. But thanks for asking. Thanks for reminding us that didn't exist in context. So now we have it restated for those that didn't know, or maybe it kind of lost the bouncing ball.
I found my Fort Huachuca t-shirt.
I have mine somewhere
today.
also still. It's threadbare.
Yeah,
but I've kept it.
I almost wore it for nostalgia purposes, but it wouldn't have been appropriate for.
The only unit t-shirts that I kept my Fort Huachuca just because it's red, and it seems like every other unit t-shirt was either brown or green. I have my SOI t-shirt, my MCT black t-shirt, because it wasn't brown or green. And then I kept my t-shirt from Sergeant's Course. Those are the only 3 unit t-shirts that I kept.
I graduated Fort Huachuca at 177 pounds.
Yeah.
By the time I was a corporal, which is just, a year or 2 later, I was 205 pounds. When I retired, I was 243 pounds. So the Fort Huachuca t-shirt might fit my son.
Yeah.
And he's
probably not.
Not. He's
my size or bigger. Yeah.
So
he's a little heavier than I am, I think, at this point.
I might have that shirt in a tote somewhere with also my medium-sized camis, which
your schmediums.
Yeah. But those were the tricolors from back in the day.
Yeah, I didn't keep any of my tricolors. I have a set of my digis that were actually mediums. So I was still in mediums when I deployed. So yeah, times have changed.
Camis run big though. I only wore a large.
Yeah, but my mediums, I actually wore them to Huntington 2 weeks ago.
Oh, nice.
And nice. I definitely wore them with the top button unbuttoned. And,
my problem with the camis, it doesn't matter what size they are. The wrist is all the same size. So if you try to roll them up
for sleeves.
At one point, probably the last 10 years of my career, my arms were over 20 inches. So they had to get cut. They were just unserviceable in the summer. And in the winter, I had to have a whole other set of camis.
That's the price you pay for being beefy.
Totally worth it.
Yeah.
Totally worth it.
So boys, what do we want to talk about tonight?
Was that all the feedback?
I think that was the only one that I saw in the socials. Yeah, was the one from Jason. But more questions, more comments, guys, and we'll get to them. So we definitely want to leave places to address those things. So Jason, since you were the one to break the seal, now that you're out there, like as you're chewing through your next couple of episodes, come back and tell us what you think. I will tell you guys that I have a professional colleague that I just reconnected with after a long time that we hadn't talked, and I put him onto the podcast. He's a podcaster professionally. So we kind of shared some podcasting, and I put him onto our show, and he instantly took Brian's side on like 3 different points. I'm not even going to read the text to you, but he thinks Brian's a genius. So clearly Dave Golding's not as intelligent as I thought he was.
I mean, he is the theological badass of our group. So Matt pulls the lever and brings the clever, and I'm just here for whatever. I'm here for diversity purposes, maybe.
Dre's our diversity hire. We had to check that box.
Non-Trinitarian, not because I'm a Negro. So
yeah.
So the last couple of days, I just, we do Nephilim talk, right? So we're in the DCW. I opened up and I read Genesis again from the beginning. And some things just kind of jumped out at me.
Okay.
So Genesis 3:15, where it talks about the enmities that's going to happen between Satan and in the woman's seed, and how she is going to bear a child that's going to, bruise his heel on, basically the Satan's seeds
I will put enmity between you and the woman,
head,
between your
right?
seed and hers. You will strike his, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel.
That one. Yes.
Yeah.
So
That's
the war kicked off right there. Like
yeah.
Here we are. It's crazy how much information and how much time lapse that goes in to the first few chapters of Genesis. I think it's somewhere like 2,000 years, the antediluvian period, right before the flood. Does that check out? Scholars think that.
Well, that's
from
before
Adam.
that's before we discount the fact that in the first like 3 verses, a couple billion years have transpired.
Right.
I'm not sure about that, but
I mean, Adam lived 900 years, right? And he was dead before
according
the flood.
to the text, but
right.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable reading it in those terms, like trying to match it to cosmic time as we know it, because they wouldn't have had that understanding of it at the time. But anyway, I don't want to derail you guys' thought process with my
but generations for sure.
Yeah. Right. I'm not sure if we're looking at actual history from what we can know outside of the Bible. The flood, the event that the ancients remembered as the flood, would have been the Younger Dryas extinction event, which was about 12,000 years. And behaviorally modern humans have existed for about 50,000 years. So that's about like 40,000 years of time between
verse 3 and verse 6, or chapter 3 and chapter 6.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable kind of lining it up by that, because it's hard.
Why?
It's hard to, because they wouldn't have had that understanding of time when Genesis was written.
Well, of course they don't, but we do now, having the benefits of everything after the fact. So the point is if if you're talking about a verse, so going, I think, and Dre, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying basically going from chapter 2, right? So where are we?
3, when the fall.
No, well, I'm saying from 2, right? So you start at, Eve was made in chapter 2, right?
Right. Yes.
Right. So the point is, from chapter 2 to chapter 3 is the fall, and then from 3 to 6, and then from 3 to 6 is the flood. And so the point is, in that short of a period,
right,
thousands of years transpire.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. Yeah.
I found this pattern where it like talks about lineage and kind of goes on, and then it usually just mentions family members in 1 or 2 verses. But throughout the Bible, when it has somebody that's either noteworthy or infamous, they spend a little bit of time on them. So everyone knows
they get some character development.
Yeah, there's the Cain and Abel story. Cool. Everybody knows that one. But what I never really paused to take a peek at was when it talks about Cain and his family line. So I found that super fascinating, because Cain's the first dude that actually lies, that's human recorded, because even Adam and Eve didn't lie. They just obfuscated, right? Like, he gave me the fruit, but she gave me the fruit.
Like gave me
your
fruit.
Toddler. It's like, what did you do?
Right.
What do you mean?
Yeah. And they're like hiding their private parts and acting naked and running around. So that's but Cain's just straight up like, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know.
What'd you do with them?
Right. So then it goes on and records Cain's family.
Mm-hmm.
And then and it's interesting that Cain would be the inventor of cities. And I kind of found it, first of all, it's weird that Cain and Seth's line have a lot of the intertwining names. So I don't know if that's because there was enough people and names weren't super common. Like Enoch was Cain's son, but he's not the Enoch that we know, right? And the same with Lamech, because uh, isn't Lamech the grandfather of Noah, but that Lamech isn't the same one that's in the same line as Cain.
Right.
Anyway, but to be the inventor of a city and to not name it after God was something that struck out to me too. So he
What do you
named
mean?
it.
What do you mean inventor of? I'm not.
He's the first dude to like create a city, right?
He created it.
Yeah, is it, there?
Where do you
Says
get
he
that
founded
from?
cities,
Yes, he's the first one noted or recorded that founded cities.
which is ironic considering how he was
Well, but
He's a nomad.
He was exiled to wander, and so he founded cities.
yeah, but he. Hang on.
But cities,
He wasn't the first one to create a city though, because he went to a city or a land that was named.
He went to a land, but that's not a city.
Okay.
And then if the Sumerian text also, the oldest city in Sumerian text is very similar to the Hebrew Enoch. I think it's Uruk is the name of that city. But the next two cities mentioned in the Bible after Cain's city is Nimrod's city and then Sodom and Gomorrah. So I find it interesting that each city that's mentioned early in the Bible is kind of an evil line.
Yeah, because God commanded humanity to multiply, increase in number, fill the earth, whereas cities are people gathering to kind of cluster and be stationary.
But here's,
I guess I passed over that. I never really. It's funny that maybe because I always stopped at some of the other stuff, but I never noticed that. I also never really picked up on the thing about Tubal-Cain.
So there's two verses that kind of list Cain's little patriarchal line, and then it comes to a dude named Lamech, and Lamech, perhaps his family might be the first ones to intermingle with angels. And the reason why you say that is because when it stops at Lamech, all of a sudden it gets more personal. It devotes like a whole more verses to him and his family. It lists out his sons, not just one son, but lists out three of them.
Oh, and you know what it doesn't explain? It doesn't explain who the father. So I see what you're saying. So it's verse 19, right? 4:19. Trey, did we lose you?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So 4:19, I see that it says Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah, and then it says, oh wait, no, I misread that. Then it says Ada gave birth. Okay, never mind.
But I think what's significant about that is, so God sets up the institution of marriage with Adam and Eve, but this dude Lamech comes along and is like, I'm gonna take two wives. Why? Because I'm not into God. And also he brags, and I think it's the first time that we see some kind of Hebrew poetry that's kind of stuck in the middle of a verse. So maybe it was a song that Lamech had written, and he just brags about killing dudes, and there's nothing anybody can do about it, right? So he kills people, and then he also talks about, he kind of mocks God by God gives Cain, so his grandfather Cain gets this protection. If anybody harms Cain, it's sevenfold. But Lamech's like, I don't need your protection, because if anybody hurts Lamech, I'm going to kill him 70 and sevenfold. And I went ahead and took two wives. And the very next time that the Bible mentions anyone taking wives, it's when the angels take women. So
you're focusing on the word take versus
having a wife, or even just having multiple wives. And then his next sons, or Lamech's sons, so you got Jebel, and he is the father of tents and cattle. And then you got Jubal, who's basically the inventor of music. And then you got Tubal-Cain, named after the first dude that killed somebody. He makes tools and weapons and things of that nature. And his sister is super beautiful. So it kind of seems like there's like an explosion of technology that happens on that family right there at that moment.
Well, there's definitely that throwback to the bronze and iron capability, which is straight up technology, right?
Or even having a job as being a cattle. So by a means of making a bunch of
Or
money,
you're saying that like before that they just existed, and now they've gone into full blown like professions,
right?
having
So like, of course you gotta herd a sheep because that's how you eat. But now it's a profession, and you can sustain that, and then it becomes a job later on. As you read through the Old Testament, lots of dudes had jobs being a herder. Um, so you have your money, your wealth, and then you have your entertainment, and then you have your weapons, and then you have a beauty, right? So here's like the question, because then the very next chapter talks about Cessline, and then the chapter right after that is fallen angels. Did these angels offer this technology in exchange for women? And would that make Nema, the sister of Tubal-Cain, the first mother of the Nephilim?
I mean,
Brian.
it seems plausible, right?
Well, I will grant that the Bible, the biblical narrative isn't always chronological. Like it's not always like sometimes the narration covers certain events, and then later on they kind of explain what was going on back here. So it's I couldn't rule it out, but I don't know that there's any particular reason to believe that, though.
I don't know if there's any particular reason to call her out by name. So there's 4 women even mentioned
that does raise eyebrows.
Before the flood.
Like that does. I mean, that does call out for explanation.
Sure. And if you look at other texts at that time, Sumerian, or if you're an ancient alien guy, you would know that aliens came down and imparted all kinds of knowledge, and gave it to people in different time periods. So maybe it wasn't exactly that family, but that period of time when there was fallen angels hooking up with women, maybe men, to become more renowned, were selling their wives off to angels to pick up some of this knowledge. And I think, going back to Genesis 3:1-5, Satan knew at that moment that it would be the seed of Eve that would bear the Messiah. So to prevent that from happening, he needed to corrupt them. So we don't know how old Cain was when he killed Abel, or how long they had been out there doing their gardening and their sheep herding. But how long was Satan in Cain's ear before, because God was still on earth somewhere. They still had to go somewhere to give that sacrifice. And Cain didn't give one favorable, which then made him mad, and he killed his brother. So that takes out 2 birds with 1 stone, because Cain can't birth the Messiah, and Abel now can't birth the Messiah. So they don't know who's going to be, when is this Messiah going to come. We need to corrupt every single man that goes. So on the whole Cain side, if we just mess up their DNA with angel stuff and angel magic and the occult, then we know that will not be. So then the Bible deals with Seth and his line.
So I've read, I mean, I think that's entirely plausible, simply because I remember reading somewhere, and it was a secondary source, so it wasn't biblical source, but it makes reference to the fact that Noah was the last pure blood, and that everything after Noah had some level of, I don't know what the right word here to use is. I'm looking for a genetic phrase, right? But some type of a derivative of that Nephilim offshoot. And I don't know. And the weird thing is, if he was the only pureblood, that means his wife wasn't. Right. So that means if we play this genealogy game, then going back up, Noah's wife couldn't have been pure. Otherwise, all of their children would have been pure. Right. And I don't remember what I was reading, so I can't cite it. It was definitely something out of the DCW, or
I think that Noah and his family was all pure. That was the point of saving them on the ark.
It's not what I was reading. And I'm
Okay.
not
Yeah,
arguing.
yeah.
I'm not arguing that. Like I unfortunately didn't bookmark whatever I was looking at. Right.
Well,
because it would have said all of them were, if that was the case. But if they were all pure, and then ostensibly they only bred with one another after they landed after the flood, then the purity would have been perpetual.
I'm not.
Or is it spiritually pure?
I'm not. Well, it says he was righteous in all the earth. The text itself doesn't say anything about his
genetics,
bloodline.
right?
But I mean, I do think there was a. I don't have anything from the text specifically to say this. I do think there was a genetic component to bringing about the Messiah, but I couldn't say. I couldn't justify that other than that it had to be of the line of David, of his, like the physical descent of David, who had to be the physical line of Judah, who of course came from Jacob, from Isaac, from Abraham, and going back to Noah and Seth. While you were talking, I never heard the stuff about Naamah before. While you were talking, I looked it up. Wikipedia has an article on Naamah, describes who she is in Genesis. She is often conflated with or connected to Naamah of the Zohar, one of the first women to seduce the Grigori and birth Nephilim. So Dre might be onto something. The Zohar, if you're not familiar, it's one of the foundational text of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, which is, of course, as we've discussed, there's a Kabbalah along with Hermetic alchemy, along with angel magic. It's a major component of Western occult tradition, which is, as we've discussed in our talk about John Dee and Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons, this whole idea of seducing the Watchers and getting this hidden knowledge. It's kind of a major recurring theme going from Genesis up through the Middle Ages to today.
Yeah, I do think that it does trace all the way back up, or that occult goes back to her, because or someone like her, because some think that even she was deified later to become maybe Venus because of who she was associated with, like Vulcan and was it Mercury, like war gods and gods of weaponry, like Vulcan
Mars.
was
Dude, that's
Mars. Yes,
that's pretty wild then, because that would be Tubal-Cain, right? The whole
Tubal-Cain,
tool and the weaponry and everything. That's actually crazy.
And if he gained that strength or gained that technology through divine intervention due to sex, well, then maybe we can get the next thing through sex, like Jack Parsons and Tom Cruise boy L. Ron Hubbard was trying to pull out, trying to get Babylon so that they can birth the Antichrist.
I do think we should be cautious about over speculating. And I think that these are interesting questions to raise, but I'm not sure we can conclude. I mean, I don't know if you were taking that somewhere, or
no, I'm taking it that I agree with you that the occult goes all the way back to Genesis 6, and
if not to Genesis 4, I guess is the
that's
here.
And that's where, when I was reading Genesis 4, I was thinking there was a direct line from 4 to 6, which crosses into our topic a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. And it's as I've been studying all this, it the obvious question is, well, why doesn't the Bible just say all this stuff outright? Why does it, like, why do we need the book of Enoch to fill in the blanks for what happened in Genesis 6 and explain what happened to the Watchers and all the other stuff that's going on behind the scenes in Daniel? And it seems like the biblical writer's purpose wasn't to call attention to the Watchers and to humans getting this magical knowledge and all of these occult secrets. Like, they didn't want the Bible to be written as a how-to for how to summon watchers and birth Nephilim. But they wanted to acknowledge its role in corrupting humanity. And so,
well, that depends on your view of the intent behind the people that set canon.
So, but
What do
no,
you-
I did read. I think I read somewhere this week, and I can't remember where it was, where the author of what I was reading. Damn it, I wish I knew. But he was saying that the Bible is accounts of God and man and that struggle and the Messiah, where the Apocrypha talks a lot about angels and what they were doing. So there's kind of this angel narrative that goes on in the Apocrypha, specifically Enoch and Jubilees, and which
Yeah.
is interesting that the name Jubal is one of the sons, which means trumpet, and Jubilees. So like he really was like the music guy.
I'd kind of like Matt to elaborate on what you just
Yeah.
said. Like, what do you mean by that?
So I've had a long-standing burr under my saddle with regard to canon, and we've talked about it a bit amongst ourselves offline. We haven't actually done it online fully. I think we touched on it during one of our episodes early on. Maybe it was I think it was maybe our Holy Spirit episode.
We had a pretty lengthy discussion about why there haven't been more
Right,
books
why there
added
haven't
to
been more
canon.
books, but I have a burr under my saddle about Apocrypha, specifically Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically Enoch and Jubilees. I haven't read much about all of the Apocrypha, so I don't have a formed opinion on all of it. But I'll hyper simplify and just kind of I'll give you guys the baby up front, then I'll give a little more detail. I believe it was the Roman Catholic Church that structured this, and whatever that means, the early church, the Vatican, to make it more specific, determined at some point that there was parts of the quote unquote Bible. And I say the Bible because it's part of the Ethiopian Bible, right? So it was the Bible at one point. These were taken out. It's not that these weren't considered to be added in. So I won't, just to be clear, I'm not interested in an alternative version of that story. It was part of the Bible. Whether it was our Bible or not, it's a different conversation, but there was more than one Bible. And that was why we had all of these sessions where all these popes or bishops came together and argued, right? But I can't help but believe that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, decided these are either too difficult to talk about, they're not helpful, or they open up conversations that are, less than beneficial to the Vatican. And so we're just going to take them out. And I think now, while saying that, any Catholic listener was just highly offended by me saying that. I think the good news is that taking them out doesn't limit or decrease the ability for one to understand God and to become saved. So it's not as if that removal neutered the Bible or took away from the ability for one to know God. But that doesn't mean that those books weren't inspired writings and or should not be part of the story for man to have, either as a cautionary tale or as just pure history. So that's my position.
When did the Vatican? So you're saying the Vatican removed books from the Bible? Which books specifically?
I'm specifically speaking to Enoch and Jubilees.
When were they removed?
I don't know. And and asking me these kinds of let's do this wizard's duel about when and which catechism was it? I don't know. But all I can tell you is if those books are in the Ethiopian Bible, they were in the Bible at one point.
I don't think that follows from that observation. It just means that the Ethiopian church had them while others.
The Ethiopian Bible is older than our Bible.
What do you like? Meaning what? Like how are you dating the age of the Ethiopian Bible?
I'm saying the Ethiopian Bible existed before all of the Vatican I, Vatican II, Nicene, Constantinople conventions happened. And so whatever canon was established by all of those guys, the Ethiopians were unaffected.
Well, you're the way you're telling this, the way you're narrating this, this suggests that like the mainstream church didn't have a Bible until the Catholic Church canonized it.
There were multiple Bibles.
Well, there were. We use the word Bible as shorthand for the collection of the canon.
Right.
It's not that they had multiple Bibles. They had the same basic core documents. Some pockets of the church didn't include Second Peter,
right.
or some pockets did include that, but also included the Shepherd of Hermas, stuff like that. I mean, so they had the Bible, they had the books we have in the Bible. They didn't, there was no reason to make an official list until certain heresies rose up, where they, like the first heresy where they had an actual church council to establish this was in Rome during the Marcionite heresy. And it was only because he was trying to get rid of all of the non-Pauline scriptures. Like he was pushing this kind of offshoot of Gnosticism, which had it that the God of the Old Testament was evil, and Jesus came to save us from the God of the Old Testament on behalf of the one true God. And to support this, he basically did away with the Old Testament. He did away with Matthew, Mark, and John, and any epistle that wasn't Paul's, and he kind of cut and pasted parts of Luke that he liked and cut out parts that he didn't, and that was the Bible he was offering. And so it was really just in response to episodes like that the church had to come up with a canon in the first place. But it's at no point did they have the Book of Enoch in the canon and then somebody made a conscious decision to remove it. I would argue that John's discussion with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, I think he's referencing the Book of Enoch when he says, so for anybody who hasn't read the Book of Enoch, it tells the story, it expands on Genesis 6, explaining how these 200 beings called Watchers descended on Mount Hermon. They swore their pact to take human women. They fathered the Nephilim. They gave all this forbidden knowledge to man. God flooded the earth. They were locked up in Tartarus. Then it tells the story of how Enoch was taken up into heaven, and he kind of had this tour of heaven in which he was shown all the geography and all the sites and emerald mountains and stuff. And he also went to Sheol to see where to the abyss to see where the Watchers were locked up. And it's kind of it was kind of renowned during the Second Temple period, during the time of Jesus, for these elaborate descriptions of the scenery in heaven. And so when Nicodemus came to Jesus at night and said, "Rabbi, we know you're a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do the signs you are doing unless God were with him." And Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again." And then they have their discussion about being born again in the Spirit. At one point, Jesus tells him, "No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, that is the Son of Man." I think that was knowing how largely the Book of Enoch loomed in the thinking of Jews at the time, and we've talked about that before, and Michael Heiser talks about that in Unseen Realm and Reversing Herman, and lots of other material he's put out. Now that we know that, I think it's a reasonable inference that Nicodemus had that in mind when he came to Jesus, and he was thinking, well, since Jesus is a teacher who came from heaven, who he was a teacher from God, well, maybe he can speak to this and likewise share some kind of report on what the geography is heaven like. Can he tell us something akin to what Enoch is reported to have said in the Book of Enoch? I think Jesus was basically rejecting Enoch as scripture when he says,
I don't think so.
That didn't happen. No one has ever seen this.
Okay. So I find it weird that you pick Enoch. So if we back up and I was to ask the question, who are the people that supposedly ascended to heaven? Or let me ask it a different way. Who didn't die?
Enoch and Elijah.
Right. Who do people say? What name is shouted when Christ is dying on the cross? It wasn't Enoch.
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
They
Is
say
that-
he's.
Is that what you're talking about?
They're referring to Elijah.
Okay, he's calling
Right.
Elijah.
Right.
Okay.
So why would you jump to Enoch as the one to refute? Why is he not refuting Elijah?
Because there's no literature that has Elijah having a vision of heaven.
There's also no literature of anybody ever assuming that Christ was Enoch, or that he prays to Enoch, but they're referencing Elijah.
Okay, so how is that relevant here?
I'm saying you're picking Enoch out of your pocket as who Christ is refuting as an inspired person. And I'm saying, why wasn't it Elijah that he was refuting?
Okay, so no one has ever. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, right? And he acknowledges him to be a teacher from God. The first thing out of Jesus' mouth is, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again.
Right.
We don't know exactly what.
So the fact that
Nicodemus-
Enoch reported what he saw in heaven,
Right.
Jesus saying that didn't happen because
But why wasn't it a vision? Why is it So there's so many times that people have visions.
Do you understand what I'm saying about the conversation that Nicodemus and Jesus were having?
I understand what you're having. I'm suggesting that you're making a bad inference about what it means. Okay. Because he clearly isn't. He's definitely not clear. He didn't use proper nouns. So it's left to interpretation.
Okay. So we do read in the Old Testament how, according to tradition and the book of Enoch, Enoch went into heaven and had these visions of the scenes and the geography there, right? We also have Elijah going to heaven, but there's nothing else.
He doesn't report back. Right. He didn't come back.
But there is a prophecy that Elijah would return before the day of the Lord. So that's why they were saying that at the cross. But as far as,
but the point is, he supposedly went also, is my point. So what I'm trying to get at is,
my point is that you are specifically saying that the book of Enoch is inspired scripture. I'm pointing out.
I didn't say that. I didn't say it is. I said I'm not convinced that it's not. There's a difference.
Okay. Fair point. My point is that Nicodemus clearly came to talk to Jesus about, hey, what's heaven look like? And Jesus told him, well, that's not something you need to worry about until you're born again, because that's the condition of seeing the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
I have spoken to you of earthly things and you have not believed. How then will you believe?
Right. He's basically saying, bro, pump your brakes.
So, but pump your brakes about
basically,
what?
That's Christ's version of going playoffs. Playoffs? We're talking about playoffs?
But the point is, Nicodemus wanted to ask him about, hey, what's heaven like?
Right.
Because why would he have this idea in mind that Jesus would have these reports about the scenery in heaven? If not, I mean, I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think I'm reaching to say that you have this body of literature in which this happens. You have Nicodemus coming and asking Jesus to give his report about heaven, and Jesus tells him, I've spoken to you of earthly things and you have not believed. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? And then he says, no one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, that is the Son of Man. According to that, this story of Enoch going into heaven and seeing the sights there, whether even if you want to argue that they didn't have that specifically in mind, what Jesus just said here still precludes that. So
yes and no. One, Enoch's story of his trip to heaven could have been a vision. And saying that nobody's had a vision of it is not what Christ said. He said nobody gets there through me, right?
That's not what the text says.
What are his exact words? What's the exact quote?
The book of Enoch. John?
Yeah.
He said no one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven.
Means him.
So that means Elijah's not in heaven. So based on that,
it means Elijah hasn't come back.
No, it means he hasn't gone to heaven.
Okay. honestly, I'm agnostic. I don't know how to interpret that. I don't know how to square what happened with what's reported with Elijah with this verse. But what I do know is that the book.
So first of all, I appreciate you saying that.
But what I do know,
I'm cool with that. I'm cool with us saying we don't know because it gets a little wrapped around itself, right? And
but what I do know is that the book of Enoch does narrate Enoch physically going to heaven and being given a
agree.
tour.
But could that have not been a vision? Like maybe he didn't physically go. Maybe he went metaphysically, or maybe he just had a vision and he's just reporting his vision. Why is that not okay?
Maybe, but that's not what the book says.
No, but I mean, so now we're getting into that whole literal thing. Did Jonah really get swallowed by a big ass fish?
But the whole point of that story, it's based on the verse in Genesis where it says Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more.
Right.
The tradition is that he was no more because he ascended, was physically taken up into heaven.
I agree.
So this idea about him having that, it wasn't physical or literal, he just had a vision.
But my point is simply that it's not clear, right? And I understand what you're saying, and I don't.
Wait, what's not clear?
Whether or not either Enoch or Elijah ascended into heaven. Like it's like I'm confused because Christ said it doesn't happen, and yet we were told previously that it did twice.
Christ didn't say that it didn't happen.
Genesis,
he didn't say it didn't happen. He said that he didn't go and come back.
No, he doesn't say anything about coming back. He said no man goes that hasn't already been there. That's what it says.
No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven.
Right.
That is the Son of
That's
God.
What he says, which is really weird.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Which then that could have just been translated wrong, or that might have been recorded improper. Maybe that's not what he said. Like, I mean, my point is both can't be true.
It's a head scratcher.
Right. Christ can't have said that and Elijah have ascended. So put a pin in Enoch. And that's my whole point is and I'm not saying you, Brian, I'm saying everybody that's ever refuted the book of Enoch.
But let's be clear here.
Leans on that story and then what Christ said in John, but it invalidates Elijah. So like, where are we?
People can make up their own minds about how Elijah fits into it. But given the prominence of the book of Enoch at the time, I think it's a safe bet that that's what they had in mind. And Jesus was saying that didn't happen. That's not an authoritative story.
I get it. And I read it this way, by the way, because Christ always.
Just a point of clarification, though. The book of Genesis does not say that Enoch was taken into heaven.
No,
that's what tradition. That's how tradition interprets that.
But when it says no more, it actually one interpretation says death didn't claim him. So there's one translation that says he didn't die.
I don't think it says that literally.
There's a translation. I forget which one it was because I sit sometimes when I'm reading a verse in Bible Gateway, and I flip through all the translations just to see the different ways that a verse is written. And there's a couple that say, and he didn't die. And it's really weird. I'll see if I can find it while we're talking. I don't want to like sit here and
Genesis 5:24, Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. And the Septuagint says, and he was not found, for God took him. Whatever that means.
Right. But I mean,
the point is,
I'm going to be honest, it's all of the different translations. It's pretty hard to hear God took him and not call that ascension.
Well, that's how tradition typically reads it. But
right. But again,
I don't know that it's necessarily demanded.
Like, I agree with you that like it doesn't jive, but the way that Jesus was known to speak in parables, like you could take away, as far as I'm concerned, you could discount and ignore Enoch and or Elijah. This guy comes up to Jesus and says, "Hey, tell me about heaven." He's like, "Why should I tell you about heaven? You don't even listen to me about the earth." And the guy's like, "No, seriously, tell me about heaven." He's like, "Look, nobody gets to go except me. Nobody's ever been. So why should I tell you?" And the guy's like, "So you're not going to tell me what heaven looks like?" That's the conversation.
Right,
It's like,
I don't care if anyone's been there. You've been there, right?
Just tell me.
I'm
You came,
I'm
like,
asking you.
You remember what it was like. Tell me. And Jesus is like, no, I'm not wasting my breath on you because it's not worth it, because you won't believe me about the other stuff. Like, to me, that's as simple as the exchange was. It's really odd to me to like use this like refutation of a person and use that as a throwback, as a reason to discredit a book that showed up 400 pages before, a couple thousand pages before. Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me. And it feels like a retcon. And I'm not attacking you because I've read this in other places. This isn't your version of this. Isn't the first time I've heard this, right? So this isn't me going at you and saying you're full of crap. I'm saying,
I would say that
to me, it's awful convenient.
It's awfully convenient for who?
For people that don't want Enoch to be canon and that want to believe that it's not canon for good reasons, because I believe it's not canon for bad reasons. And, by the way, all of our Catholic listeners think there's a third person that ascended, and that's Mary. Okay. They believe that Christ's mother ascended and didn't die. So there's actually 4 if you count Enoch, because there's Enoch, Elijah, Mary, and then Jesus ascended after he died.
Well, I mean, whatever you think about the canonization process, the fact remains, if Jesus said no one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, then Enoch did not go into heaven. And if Enoch did not go into heaven, then the book of Enoch that reports this is not inspired scripture telling of actual events.
So I believe a week or 2 ago, we had an entire conversation around inspired writing and whether or not the words had to be accurate for the inspirational implications to be valid. Right.
Well, yeah. And I kind of wish I'd been quicker on my feet when I had that conversation. The medium is not necessarily inspired. The message is inspired. The medium is not necessarily. But for something like humans reporting eyewitness history, that things that happened on this earth in human experience, that's one thing. If there's a story about a man going to heaven and seeing and describing the geography and hearing from and having conversations with angels, you're only going to get that by divine inspiration. That's not in the category of the Gospels, which are written in the genre of history.
Right.
So
I get that. I get what you're getting at. But again, I don't understand why a little bit of peeling the curtain back through a vision isn't plausible under the pretense of it having been like, because I mean, I don't know that we believe or are told that Enoch wrote the book of Enoch, right? It could have been oral tradition passed down and then was written by somebody else. I don't even know that that's described well, right? Like, who wrote Genesis? It's ostensibly the story of Moses, right? But like, did Moses write it? Who was the dude with the pen on paper that actually wrote it? I don't think we know that.
We don't.
Right.
But it was.
So
Jesus thought it was scripture. So.
Right. But he also references Enoch quite a fair bit.
So does Jude.
Right. And so my point is that the book can be, chunks of it can be incorrect from a literal or an absolute standpoint, but the gist of it could be valid, right? Like, the gist of it was, I mean, at the end of the day, Enoch is about the watchers. It's not about Enoch going to heaven and coming back, right? Like, that's a tiny portion of the book.
No, the majority of the book is Enoch's visions in heaven. There's the tinier portion is the first few chapters where it talks about the watchers. And I would say that Enoch's value is not because the book of Enoch is itself inspired scripture that should be read devotionally, but because it preserves this backstory that existed beyond the book of Enoch.
Isn't it believed that Enoch is written in chunks also? So like the first section of it is written at a different time than the next couple sections.
What I've read is
so it could be like first and second Enoch, really. And I think that it is broken down that way. If you would like get an Apocrypha app, it would give you like first, second, third, and fourth Enoch.
Yeah, second Enoch was written like after the beginning of the church. Like that's not, but
yeah.
it preserves a lot of Jewish traditions that grew out of it, but only First Enoch is really in play when you're reading the New Testament.
Okay.
Yeah.
But again, not because Enoch itself is inspired, but because it preserves the background story that was commonly held in the culture about Genesis 6 and about Mount Hermon. And
I mean, to be the fact that the title of Mount Hermon isn't even written in biblical text, right? That comes from Enoch, right?
yeah,
I don't believe the word Mount Hermon exists in the Bible.
That's not true. It's throughout the Bible, but
As it relates to the Watchers,
it's alluded to in the Psalms, like there's a psalm about how God's dwelling is in Zion, and how Mount Hermon looks on with envy, and how God's anointing falls like the dew of Hermon. So it's without that background that you get from the Book of Enoch and the understanding that Mount Hermon was understood to be a like a major sacred site at the time, like those references don't make a lot of sense.
right?
But no, Mount Hermon is
Right.
mentioned.
That's what I
mean.
mean is there's no reference of it as a meaningful place, as meaningful as
Well, it's not
related to the Watchers,
explicated.
and right.
It's not explicated on why it's meaningful, but once you understand that it was meaningful and why, then those things make sense. It's kind of like what I was saying before about how the Bible doesn't go into it doesn't go into a lot of detail about the Watchers and the Nephilim and the exchange of the Watchers giving forbidden knowledge to man, but it is alluded to, and once you understand that, so much of the Bible kind of comes alive.
Well, in fairness, the Bible doesn't give a lot of explanation about a lot of things, right? Like it doesn't ever specifically explain Satan in a sense that we've built an understanding of him, right? Like the whole, the morning star, fallen angel, Lucifer is Satan, is the devil. That's not drawn out in connected dots. Like
esoteric texts,
right? You have to have a lot of like external writings and then a whole lot of offline theology to come to that place.
Well, it's kind of like the other stuff. Like when you have that understanding of the divine council worldview about how there are these supernatural beings behind the nations that are worshipped as gods, then when you read Isaiah 14, where it talks about the morning star and the Lucifer light bearer, then that makes sense that it's talking about, it's not talking about the physical mortal king of Babylon, but the power behind Babylon.
But my point is, if I'm not mistaken, there's a verse somewhere where Jesus is described as the morning star.
That's the Book of Revelation.
Yeah. Right. So my point is it's one of those things where it's like, wait a minute, I thought the morning star was the devil. Like now the morning star is, and it's like, is that because he replaces it's not as straightforward as a lot of, casual Christians might walk around thinking. Because, especially if you grew up in the church like I did, right? You're just told this is this. The snake was the devil was the morning star was Lucifer, was an angel. Now it's Satan, is the Leviathan. They're all the same. And you're like, so like, you got to become that, the scene from Sunny in Philadelphia with the dude with the strings all over the wall for it to like, to draw that conclusion. And there's a couple of inferences that had to be made also to get there. So I'm not saying he's not right. But my point is it's not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. That's all.
Yeah. It's like I was saying a few weeks ago, you have to put yourself in the position of the ancient reader and understand as best you can, what is the cultural background that this is written in. And then it like when you use the Book of Enoch and when you look to the Enuma Elish and other ancient Near Eastern content about, what Mount Hermon.
What did you just say? The what?
The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That Enuma Elish.
The Enuma Elish.
That's my next purchase for my bookshelf.
Everyone's fourth favorite ancient Near Eastern text.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you have that background understanding, the Bible makes a lot more sense. And like the Tower of Babel, people read that and without understanding what a ziggurat was, or what Babylon was, or how ancient Near Eastern worship worked. People think that mortals are trying to build a tower so humans can get into heaven.
They could, like an elevator.
Yeah. Like the International Space Station, where they can but no, it was a invitation for heaven to come here.
For sex.
Unless you're a biblical flat earther, in which case they were trying to pierce the veil into heaven.
Okay.
Why?
Wow.
Don't ask me why. I'm not a biblical flat earther.
Well, we're gonna have to find one of these.
Explain
it to me.
Explain
it to me like I'm a Lance Corporal.
You're making a.
I'm not making a joke. Like these people exist.
I know. I mean,
and they believe that there's a limit to the sky, and that heaven is on the other side of it. Like there's like
Elon Musk just pierced that.
It's all fake. They believe that everything about us launching stuff into the sky never really happens, and it's all showmanship.
The thing is, they did.
I have an iPhone.
They did believe in a flat Earth when the Book of Genesis was written,
along with everybody else.
Yeah, it's still not. It still wasn't that. It was still a ziggurat. It was still.
Oh, I'm with you. I'm just saying there's another way to read that. Yeah.
I just don't want to leave the people thinking that if the Earth is flat, therefore the Tower of Babel was for humans to get into heaven. Because, but also another.
Right. I
thing,
mean, it's funny because even the Scripture says that, right? The Scripture God doesn't say they're trying to get to us. He says they try to be like us.
Yeah. Also, another example of when I wish I had thought more quickly on my feet, when we were talking about ancient Near Eastern ritual involving sex, I should have just said that the third act of Ghostbusters. That's what they did.
What do you mean?
I was explaining how there are rituals, there was all this ritual sex to invite the gods to mingle with mortals, and to doing this kind of ritual, this kind of sympathetic magic, whereas mortals have sex and it's supposed to represent the gods. The third act of the first Ghostbusters movie, when Sigourney Weaver and Rick Moranis get possessed by demons and they become the keymaster and the gatekeeper and the keymaster, and then they hook up, and then this brings about Gozer the Gozerian, who is depicted as this ancient Sumerian deity.
He was the one in the painting, right?
No, that's the second one.
That's Vito.
Thinking of, yeah.
Oh.
That's the master of evil. Try to battle my boys. It's not legal.
That was Ghostbusters too.
Only a Carpathian would choose New York City and not beautiful San Fernando Valley.
Yeah, I don't know about any ancient Near Eastern practices going on in Ghostbusters 2, but Ghostbusters 1, that's a pretty good amalgamation of what was going on. I should have just led with that.
If we just find somebody that kills aliens and another dude that shrinks his children, then boom, we can have sex magic.
Okay, I see what you did there.
That was a lot. So, you did a lot of things there.
We just gotta find, or maybe Dark Helmet. We can find.
I was going to go there next.
Dark Helmet, or maybe the guy that protects the dude in My Blue Heaven.
Are you trying to say Capiche?
Yeah, and Jessie, the yodeling cowgirl, along with him in that film. That's what
I never saw that movie.
Well, you're wrong. So,
My Blue Heaven's pretty.
Sorry.
Sorry, I failed you again. Pretty good. Yeah.
Keep failing you guys.
And it's one could almost say it's infamous.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Brian's never even seen it, and he's old enough to have watched it.
I feel attacked. You're old.
Me?
Yeah. So,
Did you have another thing you wanted to bring up, Brian? Because I thought you wanted to talk about.
So I think that Brian has an opportunity to explain to us why the resurrection solves the problem of evil.
That was the teaser you threw out at the end of the other
Yeah.
episode.
Now we're like, what are we, like 2 hours in? But,
Oh, we got time.
We got plenty of time.
I'm
We've
sure
actually been moving along pretty decent. We've covered a handful of topics today,
Yeah.
so
I'm sure everyone tuned in for that.
So thank you,
and
Edward, for telling us to get on with topics, and here we are getting on with topics, and we still have time left.
Yeah. Yeah, because I feel like, well, this works out pretty well, because I feel like I failed to lay the basic groundwork for answering the problem of evil. And the resurrection kind of completes it on the other end. I feel like I put a lot of meat in the middle, but I didn't start very well. I didn't finish very well. But the first thing would be,
that's a good sandwich.
Right.
I prefer there be more meat in the middle than, the rest of it. But
well, this is more like the I can't think of
this
a
is more
good
like a Monte
analogy.
Cristo.
This is more like the meat that completes the sandwich and the very core of it. Like I gave a lot of bread. Anyway,
you're failing at that analogy.
Yeah,
you should just move on.
I blame you. You brought in the sandwich analogy.
That's fine.
But so the concept of evil I mean, you can't have evil as a concept without God. For something to be evil rather than just something that we don't happen to prefer, there has to be good against which to compare it. Otherwise, it's just what we don't like, which doesn't have any real moral content or value. For there to be evil, you have to have objective good. For there to be objective good, you have to have God. You guys follow?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of atheists that think their things are good.
Okay, but what do
I don't know what that's based on, because that's the question I ask them every time.
I mean, I say a lot of things are good, and very rarely is it aligned to the divine, right? Like good and bad are ends of a spectrum, right?
Where do morals come from?
How are they ends of a spectrum?
Well, hang on, we're combining three different concepts. So there's good and bad. There's good and evil, which is different than good and bad. So that type of good is different. Maybe you should call it divine, evil and divine. And then there's good and bad, because good and bad is just a scale on 1 to 10 of how much you like something.
Well, that's what I mean. Like,
right. With 5 being neutral, everything on, smaller than 5 is bad, and everything bigger than 5 is good.
Yeah. So I think that's what he's saying. He's saying without God, then there is no divine and evil. There's only good and bad.
Right. And good and bad defined as what we happen to like.
Okay.
If you're a sociopath and you enjoy stalking and murdering co-eds, well, that's good. There's people stopping you from murdering co-eds. That's bad. If there is no objective,
Aleister Crowley's will, right?
Well, but it's not. But hang on, though, that's different. So you're talking about you're talking about hedonism. No. As opposed, that's what hedonism is, right? It's just following what you want to do.
Hedonism could be a particular value, but if there's no purpose to life, if there's no God who created us and with intending humanity for a certain purpose and intending for us to live a certain way, for there to be standards for human conduct, then the person who chooses to value stalking and murdering co-eds and then dies of a heroin overdose because he's about to be caught, well, that's just as valid a way to live your life as
right.
Raising a family. Or
so say we all agree on that point.
Yep.
Where are you going with that?
Well, I'm just saying, like, that's kind of the foundational issue to answering the problem of evil. For evil to even exist as a category, you have to have some sense of what ought to be in order to say this is wrong. And for that ought to exist at all, even as a concept, there has to be a God. Like, if we're like all moral, Morality is a matter of obligation to conduct ourselves a certain way.
Is that a long-winded way for you to say that the problem of evil only exists because God exists? That we can't even have a problem of evil without God?
Yeah,
Okay.
But
Okay.
that is, I wouldn't say it's long-winded. I think you have to.
Well, it was a lot more words than I used.
You have to explain why that is. If somebody brings up the problem of evil to explain
why there's no
God,
and you're like, actually, it's the other way around. The problem of evil only exists because God exists.
Yeah, if you just answer them with that, they're going to be like, "Nuh-uh, what are you talking about?" But it's not. You have to explain. Okay, well, what is good and what is evil before they get that.
I think the bigger thinkers, when they say there's no God, then they say there is no good and evil. There just is.
Right.
And then we decide on things that are good by social contract. So if we have, if the people that live in my space think that that's good or bad, then it's fine.
People live in my space, like Tom.
Like Tom. Like, first of all, babe, who the fuck is Tom?
Shout out to Tom.
Yeah, but and then if you can expand that space to a city, and if you can expand that space to a county, state, country, then we all agree what's good and what's bad, and we can change it on a whim, right? We can say that.
Well, I mean, humans have done that, right? Like the French went to bed one night accepting an emperor or a king, and then they woke up and were like, "We decide you can't be a king, and we're going to kill the king, and we want to govern ourselves." Right. So like they just decided.
So it says, get your morals away from me, because those don't exist. The only morals is our collective morals of what we're going to do. So what do you say to that guy that says there's no God because there is no good and evil? That's the problem with evil, because there is no evil.
When I encounter that guy, I always ask him, were the Nazis objectively evil, or do we just not like what they did? Like, let's say the Nazis had won, and so we're all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, German-speaking Aryans now. And
we could also be Japanese. I've seen Man in the High Castle.
Right.
Okay. Sure.
Half and half.
Matt's people still get to be around. But the point is, everybody now living agrees that the Holocaust was awesome. Matt, you're Japanese.
I know. I'm just trying to be more Japanese.
Oh, okay. You looking more Japanese looked like you were staring very disapprovingly at me for what I just said.
It's the same thing. Like that's very Japanese.
Okay. So if that happens,
greatly disappoint me, Brian.
I feel it. I can feel it through the computer screen. But let's say they won World War II, and now the Nazis, the Axis powers now rule the world, and everybody agrees the Holocaust was the best thing that ever happened.
Right.
And now that the world is rid of Jews, it was a great thing, because everybody agrees with that. Does that therefore make it good?
Yeah,
I think it does. That's the problem. Yes. For humanity, the answer is yes.
I think most people would.
That's because most people don't live in that world because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, but most people are.
Let me ask you this, Brian. Let me ask you this. I have a way to explain my answer real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
So what if our leader decided that we were so bad that he needed to kill 98% of us on the face of the earth? Was that bad?
Are you talking about God flooding?
Of course I am. Yeah. Because it seems objectively pretty freaking horrible.
But they weren't us. They were Nephilim.
Let me address.
Not all of them. They weren't all Nephilim. No, there was a lot of regular humans that died too.
My point is that, well,
go ahead.
Most people are extremely reluctant to say that the Nazis would still be wrong. It was just that everybody on Earth would be morally wrong to think that, which of course presupposes a standard greater than all of humanity. And my point is that morality means we have an obligation to behave a certain way and to abstain from certain things. And the question is, obligation to whom? You guys are saying the obligation is to the collective. yet we regard the abolition of slavery to be an objective moral improvement.
Now,
But for 6,000 years, it wasn't.
yeah.
Well,
I mean, so
but hold on, let me address that. If you go back and look at how they justified slavery, contrary to popular misconception, slavery did not emerge out of racism. Racism grew out of a need to justify slavery. At the time, they acknowledged the moral principle that it's wrong for humans
at what time?
The antebellum South.
I don't think racism.
But I said 6,000 years.
Yeah, I don't think racism evolved out of slavery. I think racism was propagated by slavery. But then Thomas Sowell's wrong. Racism existed well before American slavery.
Well,
racism existed across the Asians, going back to the three kingdoms of China.
Racism if you just mean a general preference, like in-group, out-group bias.
That's all racism is.
Sure. But no, the racism that we're talking about, the anti-Black racism
that's what you're talking about. You're conflating all racism as white versus black.
No,
I'm saying racism.
I'm making the distinction right now.
Okay, that's fine. I would agree with you that white versus black racism was probably fueled and propagated and evolved because of colonial slavery or whatever era we want to call
this
that.
Idea that Black people are inherently inferior, therefore not fully human. That was their justification for slavery, because they knew slavery is intrinsically wrong. It's wrong for one human to own another human and treat them as property.
I don't think that's true.
And so they got around it. If you read
humans believed it was okay. Like, it goes back to biblical times. The Egyptians didn't think that enslaving the Hebrews was intrinsically bad.
You're right. They didn't, because they believed their gods allowed it. They believed that they were superior to the Hebrews,
which made slavery okay. Slavery has always been viewed as okay.
And it
was essentially Americans that decided it wasn't.
No, it was the British.
It was Western culture.
But it was actually the Bible,
Christians
that condemned it. If you look at how slavery appears in the Bible, slavery existed for the benefit of the slave.
I agree, and that's a whole nother. We should probably put a pin in that one as a whole standalone conversation, because that one needs a few hours to flesh out.
And also,
it was like soft R slavery versus hard R slavery.
They didn't really believe in transcendent morality as a developed concept in the ancient world. Like, if you read,
what do you mean by transcendent? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, they had a sense of morality, but it was this idea that, the intrinsic value of human life, that it was sacred because we were made in the image of God. You didn't have that until
right, because it was like if you killed somebody, you owed their family like the value of a donkey or whatever it was. Like, I remember reading that. And what was that? Was that like Hammurabi and stuff like that? Like they just they put a value on human life. There was absolutely a value.
Yeah.
And your daughters had a value. It was whatever you could get in betrothal for them. Right. And that was literally the value of your daughter.
But now the genius of Christianity is in establishing the value of an individual human life, because we're made in the image of God. And that's why we have this standard by which we can look back on the Egyptians and other ancient pagan cultures and say, well, they were wrong for burning widows with their husbands. They were wrong to to buy and sell people, to murder on a whim, to treat people as cattle. We had that moral principle in the antebellum South. That humans are made in the image of God, and it's wrong to enslave them. Therefore, we have to get around it that somehow by reasoning that, well, Black people aren't fully human, so that makes it okay. Which of course is, it's of course nonsense. Nobody believed that prior to the need to defend institutional slavery as an institution. But this goes back to a few weeks ago when I was talking about the moral argument, and along with the cosmological, teleological, and argument from consciousness, how I don't think that they necessarily prove God's existence to any degree of final certainty, but they should make God's existence, their cumulative effect is to make God's existence more reasonable to believe than not, because some of their premises are not falsifiable, and so the arguments might not be, they're not, you can't be certain of their truth. But like the moral argument is one of them, because it may well be at the end of the day that morality is nothing but a social construct, but nobody can really live that way. Like it unravels when you try to live consistently with the idea that it's nothing but a social construct. Therefore, if I don't care about society's approval, if I can escape the power of the law, and
or I can affect it to my benefit.
Yeah, exactly. Then whatever I do is right automatically, because I'm not obligated to anybody higher than myself. Nobody can really live that way.
No, and that goes back to the premise that the founding fathers had an expectation that the people of America would have that higher belief system. That's the only way the Constitution fully works.
Our Constitution was made only for immoral and religious people. Yeah. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
But I find, so I guess if I was going to nitpick on that quote that you just rattled off, which nice, by the way, if morality was intrinsically tied to and dependent upon religion, they wouldn't have felt the need to call those two words out separately, right? I mean, that's one of those things where it's like, why'd they have to say both? Because you could have one without the other, or you could have both.
I don't agree with that. I mean, I think it's a common idiom even today to reiterate something by repeating a synonymous term. And I think he's saying that in order to group morality and religion as related.
Well, you group them together because they're good people. But that doesn't, the point is, can one exist without the other, right? Like that, who are your good people, your moral people, your religious people, AKA Americans, right? Like I think that's what they were trying to say.
Yeah. And I think I agree.
You disagree with me, by the way. You disagree with me. I'm going to help you out.
Okay.
Because I said there's both. They can be mutually exclusive, but they tend to be the same group. Like if you had a group of people in a room, right, and you said, I want all my good people over here and all my bad people over there, and all the good people shuffle over here and all the bad people shuffle over there, I'm suggesting some of those good people would be atheists that happen to be high moral character. You're suggesting that high moral character can't exist without God.
Okay. Let me clarify here. We often confuse ontology for epistemology when it comes to the moral argument.
What does that mean?
The way that the moral argument is often and erroneously depicted is, like you said, in order to be moral, you have to be religious. So like if you don't believe in God, then you're not going to be a moral person.
Oh, and you're saying whether or not an individual chooses to believe in God doesn't matter because God exists, therefore morals exist? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying what Paul said in Romans 2:14 and 15, where he said that when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, showing that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences often accusing, often defending them. The point being that it isn't that you have to believe in God in order to be moral. It's that everybody is already moral. Therefore, God exists. And so
I don't feel like that's what Paul was saying. I feel like Paul was saying, I know they're not Jews, but if they're doing the things that we would tell them to do anyway because they're good people, they're just as good as Jews. I feel like that's what Paul was saying because he was speaking to the church, the other church people. He was writing that to James and Peter and John and saying, hey, don't hate these Gentiles because they still do really good stuff. Right?
No,
isn't that what he was?
No, he was writing to the people of Rome.
He was writing to this was in Rome, and he's basically laying out the case for the gospel and explaining what it is and how everybody has fallen short of the law, showing that nobody is right before God based on their own merits. and he's pointing out how even Gentiles who have this moral compass, that they show that the laws given to the Jews are universal, that they're things even Gentiles understand intrinsically because of their own conscience.
Right.
So because everybody is already moral, is what he's saying. Therefore, if you unpackage what morality is, that proves God's existence. Meaning morality is an obligation to behave a certain way. To whom are you obligated? Is it society? Well, what if society, I mean, and it goes back to the I saw this framed brilliantly recently in relation to the gay rights argument. The culture today says that if you don't approve and affirm of homosexuality, well, you're a bigot, you're wrong. Okay, well, why? Well, because that's the demand of our culture. That's what our culture says. Okay, according to whom? Well, that's because of it's just our societal standard.
Right.
It's just this sort of in the air. This is the standard that's been inculcated and modeled in our TV shows and movies and pop culture. But
thanks Disney and Netflix.
Yeah, if that's true, if the fact that society as a whole approves of it and demands this of everyone in order to be good, well, that means 30 years ago, when homosexuality was all but universally condemned, it was the gays and the people who approved of them who were wrong, according to this standard.
I don't follow.
Okay. So you would agree that according to our culture, it's...
So you're saying that the standard shifts and morals shouldn't shift because you're obligated to God and not to society.
Well, I'm saying
and the whims of culture.
I'm saying that if culture and society are the highest obligation of our morality, then there was a time when slavery wasn't wrong because everybody approved of it.
Right.
But we look back on history and we say, well, that's wrong to do that. That was an objective improvement in our collective morality that we figured out that slavery was wrong.
We even canceled people for it.
What's that?
We even canceled them for it and yanked down statues and men who were once heroes
changed the name
no longer
of military bases and schools and whatnot. Yeah.
Right. So we're holding them to a standard and deciding that they've fallen short of it. Therefore, they have to be erased from history. Well, to what that standard can't just be society, because
the standard is self.
Because
that's where we are.
That's where they are, and it's self-refuting though, because I mean they turned it into just might makes right. But if that's the highest obligation of morality, then had the Nazis won, they'd be right. Had the South won the Civil War, they'd be right. Had gay activism not succeeded in winning cultural approval for homosexuality, they would be wrong, according to their own terms. So for morality to matter at all, if that's the highest obligation, it unravels. It doesn't mean anything. It's just there is no good and evil. It's just power. But and as far as we can prove from that argument itself, that may well be true. It may well be true that morality is nothing but a social construct. But the fact that it's impossible to live that way, that living as if that's true, is a leap into absurdity. And we rebel against that in our the core of our being. To live in sanity, we have to acknowledge that there is an authority to whom we're obligated, greater than man. That authority by definition is God. He is the moral absolute, again, to which all other moral values are relative. And again, if that moral absolute doesn't exist, if it's all just shifting sand and cultural preferences, then it doesn't mean anything. There's nothing ultimately right or wrong. which goes back to the problem of evil. We really just can't in any practical terms really accept that there's no such thing as evil. Even people who say that, and if they're sincere when they say that, they can't go through a day living as if that's true. So the problem of evil on those terms basically refutes itself. But as I was explaining last week, the entire Bible is that issue of the way the world is and how it's not the way it's supposed to be. That's the central theme of the Bible. That's the entire underlying conflict that Genesis through Revelation was written to address, and the resurrection is the answer to it. Whatever else you think about God's purposes, whether you think the existence of humans and free will is worth the suffering, in the crucifixion, he took his own medicine. He took the worst of it upon himself. So it can't be said that he's just looking down aloofly while we suffer, and we're just supposed to just dispassionately waiting for us to trust him. He came down and took it himself. But the resurrection is his promise that every tragedy, every death, every suffering that we endure, that's going to be redeemed. He's promised that happy ending, because the resurrection is the preview of our own. It's the proof and promise that he's going to resurrect everybody. Everybody who belongs to Christ will likewise be raised. That's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 15, among other passages. But if the resurrection happened, if Christianity is true, then we have that as a promise. And so no amount of suffering we endure now won't be righted when he returns. So I feel like there's a lot more that could be said about it, but I also feel like it's kind of self-evident. So it's belaboring the obvious at this point.
There's obviously a lot to unpack in that. And I think we went off intended topic there, because I think you were explaining, and you actually have never explained what you said you were going to explain, is that the resurrection solves the problem of evil. We've kind of talked all around this, and we got into the moral argument before we actually got to the actual point of what the resurrection does to satisfy or solve the problem of evil.
That's because the resurrection solving the problem of evil is like a 2-verse answer. So he had to set it up. He had to
tell us that so he could tell us this.
And I actually think he's right on that. And because he would have just said it and we were like, oh, okay, but we wouldn't have set up what evil actually is.
Right.
And so how can the resurrection solve this problem if we don't define what it is?
Right. But I still think I don't want to reopen the entire problem of evil can of worms, but I think it's an important conversation. And I think it's more important than people realize, because and I'll go back to what I said last week and I'll restate it, right? The combination of free will and the problem of evil is the problem with people leaving Christianity. It's not understanding those two things. And for some people it's one, and for some people it's the other, right? Some people get caught up on the free will part, and they're like, why would God give us free will to make these mistakes that could potentially damn us? And then that gets conflated or wrapped into the problem of evil, right? Why would God create an imperfect world that is full of suffering and misery if he loves us and is all powerful and all knowing? I think those two questions are the root of people leaving the faith, right? Or not joining the faith, whichever direction it is. But I can't help but think that, but it kind of brings to me, it goes back to, so Brian, you talked a lot about how evil, right? Or, the why. I'm more interested or more focused on the what, because, and I think we talked about this last week, but I'm not sure I stated it clearly or fully. Everything's not evil, right? To go to the water boy and old Bobby Boucher and his mom, the devil is not everything bad, right? Everything that happens. And I know we talked about this, we hit on weather and, meteorological disturbances and those kinds of things. But even a person doing something bad, quote unquote, is not evil in of itself, right? And and I don't know if this makes sense. Maybe it's a distinction that's not relevant, or it's a difference without a distinction. But I personally think of the two different words, and I think of evil and wicked, and I think of them as being distinct. And what the reason is to me, when I think of evil, I think in terms of supernatural, being opposed to God. And then when I think of wicked, I think of being opposed to man. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody, but that's kind of how I frame it in my mind. So when I'm thinking about somebody just doing something, stealing from another person, that's not necessarily evil, but it is definitely against the moral social contract.
Is
right?
it sinful?
Well, I mean, if we're going to get into, does it violate one of the 10 commandments, then we could go that way. Right. But I think there's things that people do that violate the social contract that don't violate the 10 commandments. Right. Or the original laws. If you're Jewish.
What would be an example?
Speeding.
Well, I wouldn't say that speeding is necessarily a violation of the 10 commandments, but the underlying principle is, Paul wrote that the law wasn't written for the righteous, but for the unrighteous.
Right.
Like
right.
Good people.
Doors are locked for bad guys, not for good guys.
Right.
Good fences make good neighbors. Right.
Right. Good people don't need to be told to concern themselves with other people's safety by not breaking the speed limit.
Right.
I break the speed limit all the time.
I broke it just 30 minutes before this show on my motorcycle.
Yeah. But I never do it that in a way that, in my judgment, endangers other people.
Right. You're making a relative decision.
Sure. But I'm 47 years old. I've never been in a serious car accident that hurt another person. So my judgment, I have a pretty good track record for my
There's a lot of qualifications there.
I've
never been in a serious accident that hurt somebody else.
I've never been in
while driving a Rolls Royce.
I've never been in an accident that harmed anyone but me and my property, is what I'm saying. Because and there have been times when I know that I've exercised bad judgment, and I look back on them with shame. But anyway,
but we could play a game with that, Brian, because I could argue that that's not true, that you've harmed other people's property because you made an insurance claim, and that insurance claim affected all of the people in your group policy, right?
I paid for my insurance policy.
You do, but you're drawing. I mean, I don't want to get into a pedantic conversation about how insurance works, but when a claim is made, it draws against the group, and the entire group pays for the claim.
Okay. And I am a sinner. I do have a sin nature. I'll save you the trouble. I concede that, but my point is that, speeding breaks the social contract.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it also, this goes, and we should probably do a whole podcast on the Sermon on the Mount. I was planning to address this when we talk about Paul, but the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.
Mm-hmm.
But I tell you, anyone who drives recklessly is subject to judgment. He didn't say that.
Jesus didn't say that.
He didn't say that. But he said anyone who's angry with his brother is subject to judgment.
Sure.
Because the underlying principle is value for other people and treating their lives as sacred. You don't have to murder them to violate that principle. Being angry isn't necessarily a sin, but you are liable to be judged for it. You might be acquitted in that judgment, but you're still putting yourself in the crosshairs of judgment, by being angry. And the point of it is, so anyway,
the problem with this is you're setting up a circular argument to suggest that Jesus wasn't very libertarian.
How do you figure?
Because what you just set up was basically a umbrella argument to obey all laws, irrespective of how inappropriate they are.
That's not what I did not. The point of the Sermon on the Mount is not Jesus giving people a set of instructions for how to be righteous and be accepted by God. The point of it is to explain how the law reveals to us that we're sinful.
Sure.
The fact that we have to be told things like don't murder
Right.
indicates that we have a fallen nature that we would otherwise murder, if not in actual execution, at least in our hearts. But so the point wasn't that Jesus was setting up an absolute law where the government's supposed to go around policing anger or lustful thoughts. The point was just to drive home what the law reveals about us. That's
no, I agree. But I would argue, and let's actually put a pin in this, because I think this is a much deeper, relevant conversation. I would suggest or offer.
It is. I have a lot to say on this, actually.
I'll say one thing, Dre, then I'll let you say something if you want.
No, I don't have a lot to say of it tonight. I think.
Oh, you want to hold it?
Yeah, I want to hold
right
it.
on.
Are you almost ready for your big Paul podcast?
I think we already did that, didn't we?
No, I have an idea that's not my idea about Paul, but a proposal that I had read about Paul that I would like to just kind of litigate.
Flesh out.
I think it would be fun.
Do it live and in living color.
Yeah.
Like you don't really believe it. It's just
no, not at all.
Devil's advocate kind of
total
thing.
devil's advocate thing, and
I'm in. I love advocating the devil. I mean,
it's actually
I didn't mean that.
Because of Paul, it means that Jesus isn't true. So that's the teaser.
That's a weird teaser. Okay.
Right.
So let me say this about law, and then let's move on, or let's shut it down. One of the two.
Sure.
I would offer that the laws that Jesus was referencing on the Mount, and largely most of the laws that he intended or seemed to uphold, were laws tied to emotion and purity of person, not laws related to asinine laws that the state creates to create revenue, right? So while we could make a moral argument about speeding because you're putting other people at risk more so than you are when you're driving slow.
It would
right?
fall under you shall not murder.
Right.
Even
but,
putting yourself at risk.
Correct. You're putting everything at risk, right?
Yeah.
But rolling a stop sign if there's no one else there has no risk factor, right? If I'm pulling up to a four-way stop and there's literally no other cars on the road, and I don't come to a full and complete stop and roll it, I've broken the law. But there was no real risk factor there, right? So you get into,
or if you don't use your turn signal in
changing a lane when there's not a car in the lane that could be affected, right? Except there just happened to be a cop behind you that saw it and goes, woohoo, I get to pull this guy over.
Right, yeah.
So my point is there's, victimless crime, and then there's real crime, right? And then there's crime on a continuum. And my argument would be that any of the crime that Jesus was referring to would not be victimless, but it would be victim-based crime, right?
Well, this sounds like a nitpick, but it's not. He wasn't talking about crimes. He was talking about sins.
I agree, but we're talking about law. So if we're gonna expand law to our legal system today, right? Like then you have to ask that question, like you just did. Was it a sin to speed, or was it a sin to do X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, and that's I think we might be getting to the same place. I would agree that there is a distinction between crime and sin.
Mm-hmm.
For certain. But is it wrong to have a social contract?
No, but it's just not the same as
right.
There's overlap with actual.
You're not
good
speeding
and
Jesus is angry at you, right?
Right.
Like that's not. Those aren't the same thing. You didn't.
It just like I would. My only point is to make that strict distinction between social social contract and actual morality. Some social contracts, as a general rule, you need a social contract.
You're suggesting that there could be a social contract that is in fact immoral at the same time.
Yeah, you have to worship Caesar as a god, or we're going to feed you to lions.
Mm-hmm.
That's a social contract that Christians broke for centuries at great personal cost. So
you can abort a baby at 8 months.
Right.
Yeah.
Or at all.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So, just just being good. And that's another, discussion. We have this illusion that we're good people because we keep the social contract. Well, I've never killed anybody or stolen from anybody. Well, you've never, we had an ice storm here several years ago, and I watched two middle-aged women get into a fist fight over a can of soup. 24 hours earlier, when
it was happening
sunny,
over toilet paper during COVID.
Yeah. I mean, that's how close we are to
By the way, both my kids have COVID right now.
Are they going to live?
Well, I'm not a prophet. I don't know. I hope so.
Maybe you are.
I hope so too.
I hope this ages well.
Oh, man. I'm
I can't believe I'm laughing.
I
It might not age well. Like, you fucking laughed at that.
I'm just laughing at how
I'll go back and rip this episode and edit
what a
it.
piece of crap I'll be if it doesn't age well. That's gonna, or it'll be hilarious when they're healthy in 24 hours.
Yeah. Shout out to both more kids.
Right.
I care about you.
Hope you guys live.
Right.
Please live.
Alyssa and Austin, I hope you get better.
But if you're uncomfortable for a minute, I might laugh at you.
Yeah, Alyssa's been sick for a minute, and she's, for those that don't know, she's an EMT, so she's out and about with people of varying levels of sickness on a regular basis. So it kind of comes with the territory.
So my point is that, like, people walk around with the illusion that I'm a good person because I haven't killed anybody and people like me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we live in a system where we just kind of unconsciously understand that there's a stick in it for you if you break the law, and there's a carrot in it for you if you keep it and you're nice to people and polite, and people want the carrot, they want to avoid the stick. Doesn't mean you're a good person.
Yeah.
Now,
no, I tend to believe that I've never murdered anybody because I watched Oz.
I mean, prison looks like it sucks.
It looks like it's a really good deterrent for me.
Right.
Yeah. So I think to that question that skeptics always ask, well, what can I just, what if I just live a good life and I'm a good person? Do I need God? Well, what is, how are you defining good
right.
according to what standard?
Right.
And the idea that, well, this idea of going to heaven for being a good person, but heaven is, we don't go to heaven, but let's just pretend we do. Nobody is damned who doesn't choose it. Heaven is heaven because he's there. Hell is hell because he's not. If you wind up condemned to hell, it's because God's just giving you what you sought all of your life. So goes back to something Dre said earlier, kind of made me think of that, and the conversation moved on, but I think it's worth saying at some point. Earlier in the week, Dre shared that video where the guy was talking about that passage in Matthew where many will say to me in that day, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons? And on that day, I will tell you plainly, away from me, I never knew you. And he pointed out, the guy in the video pointed out how they were trying to justify themselves by what they did, not by what Jesus did for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of drove home to me that, like, Jesus, nobody is ever condemned for eternity because Jesus doesn't want to save you, because Jesus doesn't want you to be redeemed. He died so you can be there with him. But if you're ignoring that, it's faith versus works, right? Right. And it's not faith in the sense that we usually think of as if you believe X, Y, and Z about God and Jesus, then you're in, you get your hand stamped for your fire insurance. No, it's faith. And it's the same thing we mean when if I say, Matt, I have faith in you, or Dre, I have faith in you. I believe in if you promise me something, I believe you'll do it. If you say you can do something, I believe you. If you come to me and, with a business plan and you say, hey, invest some money and I can give you X amount of return in X amount of time. If I have faith in you, I'm going to invest in that. It doesn't mean I just nod and give intellectual assent. If you have faith in Jesus, you believe the good that he teaches, is for your good. You adopt his values as your own because you believe that's where the best return is. It's not a quid pro quo. It's marriage, not prostitution, to go back to an earlier conversation we had. But yeah, I kind of went off
that conversation was offline, so that made no sense to anybody when you said that, but I know what you mean.
No, we had it on the podcast about how the difference between prostitution and marriage is that, like, so a lot of people talk about.
No, we didn't.
Yeah, we had it on the podcast. I promise.
It must have been on a podcast you were on, a different before us.
All the podcast appearances I've done.
Was it when I stepped away while you were giving your faith story? You talked about prostitution in marriage?
No.
Okay.
I mean, but we often talk about, like, in terms of, if you live a good life, God will reward you with heaven. And if you do bad things, you're going to be punished for it by going to hell, as if it's a quid pro quo, as if we're doing something for God, and then in to reward our good efforts, he gives us eternal life. That's not how it works. It's that we're members of the family, and we do this, but because doing it is its own reward. We obey him because we love and trust him, and we know that the things he commands, that's for our good. Like, sin doesn't hurt God. God hates sin because it hurts us. If he doesn't want us to do things, it's because it's bad for us. It's bad for society. It's bad for other people. But if we invest ourselves in things that are bad for us, that lead to death, then that's where it leads. That's the faith is at the early stages before we're mature. Yeah, we do it because he said so, because we trust him. But as we mature and we come to love what he loves and hate what he hates, we do things, we obey him because it's his own reward. And it would be a punishment to not do it. So it's more like, and I compared it to prostitution versus marriage, because to somebody outside, to an what are you laughing at, Trey?
I'm laughing at we're going so long.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I feel like I explained it better before, but
this is good stuff. But I'll say to our detractors that this time we didn't go long because we took too long to get to the point. We're going long because we're taking too long to drive it home. So.
The way that we talk about heaven and hell, it resembles prostitution in that it's a quid pro quo. The man pays the prostitute, gives her money, and he gets something in return that isn't related to it's commodified. It's transactional. With a marriage, the honeymoon night is not a reward for the successful courtship. It's the consummation of it. The courtship is done for its own sake because you enjoy each other, because you want to do it, and doing it is its own reward, and the relationship grows, and then it consummates to the wedding night, and then life comes forth, and you have a family, and it's not a quid pro quo. It's not transactional. It's done for its own sake. Likewise, following Jesus Christ, putting our faith in him, we do this because we believe in his teachings for their own sake. We don't do it because this is the price we have to pay to get what we want at the end. Likewise, hell, eternal damnation, by definition, it's separation from God. It's just God wants everybody there. He wants everybody to turn to him and put their trust in him and be united with him for all of eternity. But people don't want that, and he's not going to force it on them. So he gives them what they want at the end. So that's all. I think I've belabored the point enough. But your response to the resurrection being the answer to the problem of evil, were you saying that that didn't? Did that make sense, or are you saying that
Who are you asking?
He's asking
Matt,
me,
I'm asking
and
Matt.
I
'Cause
didn't
I'm-
think we talked about the resurrection as it solves the problem of evil that much. We talked about the problem of evil, and we talked about God, and then we got into the moral argument, and we I felt like we sidestepped what you had said that you teased the last episode with, that you needed to say this one thing and it was gonna solve it, and then I felt like we got into it, then we went like around it rather than going directly into it.
Yeah, I was kind of correcting the fact that I didn't set up what I said last week by laying the basics about what evil is and how the problem of evil, like for there to be evil, you have to have God in the first place. So evil doesn't refute God, it depends on him. And then let's just fill in all the stuff I said last week. And then, and the resurrection solves the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
I mean, we're okay.
It's like self-evident. Resurrection, it's a promise. Redeemed it. That's it. No,
I mean,
right.
the complaint of the problem of evil is that there's suffering and death here. People
Mm-hmm.
kill each other. People die prematurely.
Mm-hmm.
There's tragedy and pain and hardship. The resurrection is God's promise. I mean, Jesus suffered the worst of it, and it was redeemed. There was immortality and glory on the other side as a promise to us. So whatever evils we suffer now, that's temporary and will be righted. So
yeah, I feel like we could solve a lot of that by quoting Jim Carrey's character from Liar Liar. Stop breaking the law, asshole.
there you go. And you can catch us on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, Facebook group, and please, hey, leave a message, even if it's just like, hey, I listened to the show, or you suck, or you're awesome, or like the guy Jason did, leave a significant comment that we can take a peek at. And if you're single, leave your number for Brian, because
stop.
So because there's 3 of us, 2 are married, 1 is not, and